Quarantine order came in at ZO340 ship time, 2 days and 11 hours out from vel-sorath station Kamalath, and I was in the lab when it hit my queue. I remember exactly what I was doing. I had my gloves on, my magnification hood down, and I was running the third iteration of a counter-agent synthesis on a compound we'd been developing for 6 weeks. A neurotoxin inhibitor, calibrated for bioluminescent nervous systems, untested on any living patient, and frankly not ready for field deployment by any standard I'd been trained to apply. 6 weeks of theoretical work, of model building, of literature synthesis, of the cautious accumulation of what we thought we understood about a class of biology that our own species had been in contact with for 2 centuries but had never needed to treat in a crisis scenario. We had been developing it as a precautionary measure, a response to an emerging class of synthetic compounds detected in the trade corridors of Sub-Sector 12, and it was, in the most honest clinical assessment I could offer myself, a promising draft, not a finished tool. I was annotating the batch record when my comband pulsed 3 times in rapid succession, which is the cadence reserved for priority traffic from the bridge. I pulled the hood up. I stripped the gloves. I read the message. It was a Conclave Sanitary Cordon Notice Class 1. Broadcast on all protected frequencies. Origin: the Galactic Health Conclave's Regional Quarantine Authority, Subsector 12. The text was formal, bureaucratic, and utterly clear. vel-sorath Station Kamalath and its surrounding approach corridors, a sphere of roughly 40 million kilometers, had been placed under full quarantine seal effective 6 hours prior. The pathogen in question was a synthetic neurovenom compound, designated SVN7, which had been accidentally released during a deep mine extraction operation 3 weeks before. The compound attacked a specific class of light-producing organelles found in bioluminescent species. It was fast. It was spreading through the station's atmosphere exchange system. The Conclave had assessed the risk of cross-contamination to non-bioluminescent species as low, but they had issued a total exclusion order regardless, on the grounds that the pathogen's behavior in novel biological environments was not yet characterized. No aid vessels were authorized to enter the cordon zone. All vessels currently en route were directed to hold at the cordon boundary or reverse course. Penalties for cordon violation were enumerated in Section 14, Subsection C, and they were not small. I read it twice. Then I calmed the bridge. Captain Aaron Vasak answered on the first pulse. He had a voice like gravel poured over slate. Not unpleasant, just deliberate, like every word had been selected from a limited inventory. And he wasn't going to waste any of them. He said, "You've seen it." I said I had. "I've been on with Conclave Regional for the last 20 minutes, he said. Their position is that the cordon is absolute. No exceptions for vessels already in approach. They're directing us to the hold line at 42 million kilometers and instructing us to await further communication." I asked him what our current position was. 31 million kilometers, he said. We crossed the cordon boundary approximately 40 minutes ago, before the broadcast reached us. We were inside it when the order was issued. I understood what that meant, technically. We hadn't violated the order, we'd been enclosed by it. There was a legal distinction, though I doubted the Conclave would spend much time honoring it. "What are you going to do?" I asked. There was a pause. Not a long one. Aaron Vasak was not a man who paused for drama. He paused because he was thinking, and when he was done thinking, he spoke. "I'm going to finish the run," he said. "I'm logging that we received the order after we'd already entered the zone, that we assessed egress as creating additional contamination risk, and that our humanitarian obligation to a population in medical distress outweighs a whole directive issued in our absence. I'm filing that log with Conclave Regional, with Earth Humanitarian Dispatch, and with the Office of Medical Ethics at the University of Nairobi, which is where I went to school and where I intend to be taken seriously if this ends in a tribunal." He paused again. "I need to know if you can work with what you have." I looked at the batch record on my screen. The counter-agent was on its 3rd iteration. The dosage calibration was theoretical. I had no data on vel-sorath metabolic response rates. I had 400 doses of something that might help and might do nothing, and might, in a worst-case scenario I did not want to examine too closely, make things measurably worse. "I can work," I said. Good, he said. I'll need a briefing in 3 hours. Get some sleep first if you can. I did not get any sleep. Shoot. Mercy was not a warship. She had never been a warship. She had been commissioned by the Earth Humanitarian Medical Service 14 years prior as a mobile, acute care platform, rated for populations up to 12,000, capable of operating in atmospheric conditions ranging from 0.3 to 2.1 standard bars, and equipped with a laboratory suite that her original designers had clearly intended to be state-of-the-art, and which I, having worked in it for 4, regarded with the grudging respect you develop for a tool that is just barely adequate to every task you put to. She carried 26 medical staff, a crew of 31, and enough consumable medical supplies for a 6-week extended deployment. She was painted white, with a blue stripe and the Earth Cross and Circle emblem on both flanks. In theory, meant something to the galactic community, and in practice meant that people occasionally did not shoot at us first. Her chief medical officer. I had been her chief medical officer for 4 years, having taken the post after a decade at the University of Cape Town's Xenobiological Medicine program and 2 years doing field work in the refugee corridors of the Outer Shear, which is a stretch of space that no longer appears on most maps because the population it once held is no longer there. I had seen bad things in the Outer Shear. I had developed a certain tolerance for bad things, which is not the same as indifference, which does mean that when the world offers you a crisis, your first instinct is to reach for the nearest tool rather than the nearest chair. The tool I was reaching for was SVN7CI, which was the name I'd given the counteragent. SVN for the pathogen designation, CI for counter-inhibitor. The naming was clinical and uninspired, and I didn't care. Because I was not sleeping, and I had a bioluminescent species dying at a rate I could not yet quantify, at a station I could not yet see, with a compound I had not yet validated. What I knew about the vel-sorath had mostly from the academic literature. They were a deep space species in the biological sense, evolved in the lightless reaches of a gas cloud that their home system's star barely illuminated, in conditions where most higher-order biology would not have bothered. Their bioluminescence wasn't decorative. It was functional, the way a cardiovascular system is functional. The light-producing organelles in their nervous tissue, called vel nodes by the xenobiologists who'd first cataloged them, were integrated into every major neural pathway: communication, cognition, emotional regulation, immune signaling. The vel nodes lit, pulsed, and modulated in patterns that their kind read the way we read faces, and which served neurochemical functions that, in non-bioluminescent species, were handled by entirely different mechanisms. Pull the vel nodes offline, damage or suppress the organelles, and you didn't just dim a species cosmetically, you began to dismantle the operating system. SVN7 targeted the vel nodes specifically. It wasn't an accident that it did. It was a synthetic compound, which meant someone had designed it, or something close to it, and the design had chosen the most efficient attack vector. The Conclave's preliminary pathology report, which had been transmitted as part of the quarantine package, described a 3-stage progression. In Stage 1, peripheral bioluminescence dimmed and flickered, with the affected individual experiencing what translated as disorientation and sensory disruption. In Stage 2, core neural pathways showed degradation, causing progressive cognitive impairment and loss of motor coordination. In Stage 3, the central vel node cluster, seated deep in the analog of the midbrain, began to fail, and from there the outcomes were not good. The station had a population of approximately 9,000 vel-sorath. The Conclave's report, dated 3 days before the quarantine order was issued, estimated that 40% of that population was showing Stage 1 symptoms. 12% had to progress to Stage 2. Early projections the Conclave had included in the quarantine package, apparently as justification for the seal, rather than as a call for intervention, suggested that without treatment, the majority of the population could reach Stage 3 within 18 to 22 days of first exposure. The quarantine order had been issued. The aid corridors had been closed. Every Conclave member medical service had received the whole directive and, to the best of my knowledge, every one of them had complied. We had not. I spent the first 12 hours in the lab. My team was 3 people: Dr. Piotr Hallinen, a xenobiochemist from Helsinki, who had been with the EMS for 7 years, and who possessed the useful quality of being technically brilliant while maintaining the emotional temperature of a man describing a pleasant afternoon. Dr. Amara Osibansu, a neurological specialist from Accra who had trained specifically in bioluminescent species medicine, and who, when I told her what we were dealing with, sat down very quietly for approximately 30 seconds, and then stood up and said, "All right, let's not waste the 30 seconds I just spent being frightened." And technician Rafi Shamir, who had been working in this lab since before I arrived, who knew every quirk and shortcut of our equipment, and whose value to the operation could not be overstated. Rafi had a habit of humming while he worked, not melodies exactly, just a low-frequency sound that varied in pitch depending on how complicated the problem was. The more complex the challenge, the lower the hum. In the first 12 hours, it was very low. The problem with SVN7CI was that it had been synthesized against a theoretical model of vel-sorath node biochemistry, derived from published research, not from a living patient or a tissue sample. We had no vel-sorath aboard. We had no vel-node tissue. We had the published literature and our own modeling, and the gap between a model and a living organism is exactly the gap that kills people when you get it wrong. What we had in our favor was that the published literature on vel-sorath biology was, by xenobiological standards, unusually comprehensive. Their species had been in contact with Conclave member worlds for 200 years. They were a studied people, and Amara Osibansu had done her doctoral dissertation on vel-node function in 3 related bioluminescent species, gave her a framework for extrapolation that was considerably better than nothing. By hour 14, we had a revised 4th iteration. By hour 20, we had a 5th. By hour 23, Amara had found a binding site analog in the vel-sorath vel-node literature that suggested our inhibitor compound might dock more efficiently than we'd originally modeled, was either very good news or a red flag about our modeling methodology, and we debated it for 40 minutes before Hallinen said, calmly, that both things could be true and that we should proceed with the modified formulation and document everything with sufficient rigor to be useful, whether we succeeded or failed. I calmed the bridge at hour 24 to give Captain Vasak his briefing. "Where do we stand?" he said. "We have a candidate compound," I said. 5th iteration. I'm not going to tell you it's validated because it isn't. What I can tell you is that it's the best formulation we can produce with what we have. It's derived from solid biochemical logic, and the woman who designed the core approach wrote her dissertation on vel-node inhibitor mechanisms in analogous species, asking for 18 to 24 hours in station to establish baseline pathology in a sample population, adapt the dosage protocol to what we actually observe in patients, and begin administration to the most critical cases. That's workable, he said. What's our ETA? 11 hours. What's Conclave Regional saying? They've escalated to formal sanction proceedings, he said, without particular inflection. Our log filing has been received and they've indicated it will be considered. In the meantime, we're directed to halt and reverse course. I've acknowledged receipt of their directive and informed them of our intention to complete the humanitarian run and submit to whatever process they want to conduct afterward. How does the crew feel? A pause. Nobody's asked to be put off, he said. I slept for 4 hours. I don't remember the dreams. We came in on the approach vector the station's automated systems offered us, because the station was still functional. The pathogen had not hit the infrastructure, only the people. And I was on the bridge when the station first appeared on the forward display, a ring and hub structure about 2 kilometers across, sitting in the long dark of a system whose star was a dim orange .40 astronomical units distant. The station was lit from within. Even on the approach cameras, you could see it. The vel-sorath station design incorporated transparent panels on every habitat level, and through those panels you would normally see a soft complex, shifting light, thousands of individuals moving and living, and communicating in the way their biology required, the way they had always lived, in a building that was essentially also a lantern. It was dim, not dark, not dead, but dim in a way that was immediately legible to me as a doctor, the way a patient's pallor is legible, before you've taken a single measurement. The light that came through those panels was irregular, patchy. There were zones of near darkness and zones of normal brightness, and they distributed themselves across the station's surface without any pattern that suggested order. The bright zones were shrinking. Petrov, our helmsman, brought us into docking on the far side of the hub, away from the primary habitat rings, at the freight and medical reception bay. Standard protocol for a hospital ship arrival. As the docking collar sealed, I was already in Medical Bay 3 with my team, reviewing the intake protocols we'd adapted on the approach. First vel-sorath I ever saw in person was the station's chief physician, Dr. Asim. He met us at the docking collar in full environmental suit, which told me he was being careful, and he was alone. Which told me he was either very busy or very tired. And when he removed his helmet in our cleanroom anteroom, I saw that he was both. The vel-sorath are smaller than I'd expected. The academic literature gives you dimensions but not presence, and in presence they are compact, bilaterally symmetrical, and architecturally elegant in the way of things shaped by a very particular evolutionary pressure over a very long time. Their integument is dark, a deep, non-reflective blue-black, and their vel nodes are distributed across the surface as well as internally, which means that a healthy individual has a continuous, subtle animation to their skin, light moving in currents and eddies according to their neural state. Asim was not a healthy individual. The light in his skin was present but slow and irregular, concentrating in dim patches at the joints and guttering elsewhere, the way a fire that is not quite out, but is not quite healthy either, will cling to its coals while the perimeter fails. He was in stage 1, maybe the edge of stage 2. He looked at me for a long moment without speaking, and the light in his chest, the broadest concentration of vel nodes in their surface anatomy, closest analog to the face as a readable surface, moved in a slow, complex pattern I couldn't read, but that I recognized as significant. Then his translator spoke. "You crossed the cordon," he said. "Yes," I said, "the conclave will proceed against you." "That's a problem for later," I said. "Right now I need your patient census, your pathology records, and access to your sickest 5 cases for baseline assessment. I have a candidate treatment. I need 24 hours of clinical data before I'll administer it to anyone. And I want to spend those 24 hours on your worst cases because that's where the math is most urgent." He studied me with the slow, dim animation of his light pattern. Then he said, "You came from Earth." "Yes, Earth is not a conclave member." "No, you had no obligation." "We had a call on our distress frequency," I said. We were already on our way when the quarantine order came through. We weren't going to turn around." The light in his chest shifted. I didn't know what it meant. I hoped it wasn't alarm. "Come with me," he said. The station was quieter than a station of 9,000 people should be. Sound carries differently in vel-sorath habitats than in human ones. Their acoustic design tends toward damping, because their primary communication is visual rather than auditory, and what sound they do produce is, in frequency, ranges somewhat different from ours. But even accounting for that, the corridors had a wrong quality. We passed through 2 residential rings and a common area, and I counted perhaps 40 individuals in spaces designed for hundreds. Most of them were moving slowly. Several were not moving at all, resting against walls or in the alcoves that vel-sorath architecture builds into every corridor. For purposes I didn't yet understand, the light in those individuals was very faint. Dr. Asim brought me to the station's medical facility, occupied an entire sub-ring on the outer hub, and which had been designed for a staff of 12 and a patient capacity of perhaps 80. It was holding 416 patients. They were in beds, on floor mats, in every available corridor space, and the improvisation was evident everywhere. The exhausted makeshift organization of people who had been doing too much for too long with too little. The attending staff, 8 of them still on their feet, all showed the dim, irregular lighting of early-stage exposure. One of them, a young physician whose name I later learned was Dr. Vel-sorath, was working with the focused, slightly over-deliberate movements of someone pushing past a state of cognitive impairment that she was refusing to acknowledge. My hand on her arm. She looked at me. "Go rest," I said. "We have you." She hesitated. Her light flickered in a pattern I didn't know. Then she put her diagnostic instrument down on the nearest surface and walked to the staff room, and I found out later that she was asleep before she reached a horizontal surface. We worked. Amara took the 5 worst cases, 5 patients who had progressed to advanced stage 2 and in 2 instances to early stage 3, and spent 4 hours with each one, running the most comprehensive baseline neurological assessment our equipment could produce. Hallinan adapted our portable synthesis unit to the station's atmospheric chemistry, which required 3 adjustments I hadn't anticipated, because vel-sorath station atmosphere is maintained at a slightly higher oxygen partial pressure than human standard, and 2 of our reagent compounds behaved differently as a result. Raffi, humming very low, rebuilt the dosage delivery system to accommodate vel-sorath biochemistry. Their metabolic rate for introduced compounds is approximately 60% of human standard, which meant our timing protocols were entirely wrong and had to be rebuilt from scratch. I went through patient records with Dr. Asim for 6 hours. His records were meticulous. Despite the chaos around him, despite his own advancing stage 1 exposure, he had maintained documentation that any hospital on Earth would have been proud to produce. I told him so. "We are a careful people," he said. His translator rendered this without inflection, but the light in his chest moved in a way that I would come to recognize, over the following days, as something close to dignity. By the end of hour 8 in station, hour 32 of our run, I had what I needed for the dosage adaptation. I went to Amara. "Tell me," I said. She told me. The vel-node structure in our worst 5 patients was degrading in a pattern consistent with our model, but at a rate approximately 15% faster than projected. The binding site analog she'd identified on the approach was real. It showed up clearly in the tissue interaction data. The good news was that this meant SVN7CI had a viable target and the inhibitor chemistry should dock. The bad news was that stage 3 progression was faster than the Conclave's preliminary report had suggested, which meant our window for intervention in the advanced cases was narrower than I'd wanted. "Can we push the first dose now?" I asked. "We're modifying it in real time," she said. "Give me 6 more hours, you have 4. She didn't argue. She went back to work. I sat with one of the stage 3 patients during those 4 hours. I don't know why I chose to do that, rather than sleep or eat or run more. Calculations. The man, I thought of him as a man, though vel-sorath gender is a different category than human gender, was perhaps 60 years old, which in vel-sorath terms means something like the far side of middle age, and he had been a maintenance engineer for the station's deep mine extraction systems. The records said his name was vel-soran Keth. His family had not been reached. The station's internal communications were degraded because the people who maintained them were sick. He was nearly dark. The vel nodes at his surface were almost entirely quiescent. The deep node monitoring equipment Dr. Sim's team had set up showed faint activity still at the central cluster, the midbrain analog, but it was erratic. His breathing was steady, which was something. He was not in pain as far as we could tell. The analgesic pathway and the vel node pathway were separate systems, and the former was intact. He just wasn't there, in the way a person is there when they are present and aware. I held his hand. I don't know if he knew I was there. I don't know if it mattered. I have held the hands of many patients who didn't know I was there, and I have concluded, over the years, that it matters to the person holding more than it matters to the patient, but that this does not make it meaningless. That being present when presence is possible is part of what the work is, regardless of whether it registers. At hour 4, Amara came for me. "We're ready," she said. The first administration was to the 5 stage 3 and advanced stage 2 cases, at the adapted dosage and the new timing protocol. We did it together, Amara, Hallinan, Dr. Asim, and me, over the course of 2 hours, with Dr. Velshan Ora rested and back on duty, monitoring the vital systems. I will not pretend I was not frightened during those 2 hours. The compound was as well prepared as we could make it, derived from the best biochemical reasoning available to us. And it might not work, and it might make things worse. And I knew those things, and I administered it anyway. Because the alternative was watching the vel nodes go out one by one and calling that a choice. We waited. The monitoring period was 6 hours. Standard adverse event window for an untested introduction. 6 hours during which we watched the deep node readouts and the surface bioluminescence indices and the vital signs and said very little to each other. I have spent a great deal of time in medicine waiting. Not the impatient waiting of someone who expects things to happen on demand. The clinical waiting that is itself a form of work. The sustained disciplined attention you hold on a readout or a patient or a process. Watching for the signal in the noise. Keeping your interpretation clean of what you want to see, so that you will correctly identify what is actually there. It is harder than it sounds. The mind wants to find patterns. It wants to reach forward and pull the answer toward itself. 6 hours of rigorous watching, when you care about the outcome, and when the cost of misreading it is high, requires a particular quality of steadiness that I have spent 22 years cultivating, and that I will tell you I did not feel in full command of during those 6 hours at Chemalith. Hallinan sat at one console and annotated his synthesis notes in a low murmur. Amara had a tablet in her lap and appeared to be reading, which I knew from 4 years of working with her was her method of managing anxiety. The same paper she already knew during high-stress waits, using familiarity as an anchor. Rafi hummed, Dr. Seams sat in a chair 2 meters from the nearest patient and was entirely still, with the deep stillness of a vel-sorath at rest. A stillness I had come to understand was not absence but presence at lower frequency. The way a star is still putting out light even when it is not flaring. Dr. Velshanora, who had returned to duty and was monitoring the vital sign array, said nothing at all, and blinked approximately once every 4 minutes. Was the tell I had identified in her for concentrated focus. The medical bay was quiet. Outside it, through the insulated walls, the station went about whatever version of its life was still available to it. The functional systems still running, the people still present and enduring. The infrastructure that did not know or care about the biochemical negotiations happening in its center. At hour 2, I noticed that the surface vel nodes on vel-sorath left arm had brightened slightly, not dramatically, not the sudden flare of recovery you see in medical dramas and never in actual medicine. A slight, irregular brightening, 3 nodes on the dorsal surface of the forearm. Pulsing with a faint unsteadiness that might have been random fluctuation and might have been the beginning of something. Not say anything. I did not want to say anything until I was sure. At hour 4, it was not just the arm. The surface nodes across his chest and neck were showing increased activity. Still dim, still irregular, but measurably, unambiguously higher on the index than they had been 4 hours ago. The deep node readout showed the same pattern. Not a surge, but a stabilization. The erratic firing had settled into something more coherent. At hour 5, vel-sorath turned his head and looked at me. His light was very faint, but it was present. It was moving in a slow, deliberate pattern. 3 pulses, a pause, pulses. That repeated itself twice before his eyes closed again. I didn't know what it meant. Dr. Asim, who was standing 3 meters away, made a sound that his translator did not render, a sound that existed outside the translation protocols, and then he said, very quietly, in his own language first, and then in the translated version, he is saying thank you. I sat down. I did not mean to sit down. My legs made the decision for me. We had 400 doses of SVN7CI and 9,000 patients. That is the math that governed the next 54 hours. And I want to be honest about it, because anyone reading this account deserves to understand that we did not save everyone, and that the choices we made about who received the treatment first were the hardest choices I have ever made in medicine, and that I would make them the same way again, and that I will carry them regardless. Tridge protocol for a population-level intervention with constrained supply is not a new problem. It has been worked out in human medicine, in theory, and in the brutal specifics of field application over many generations of crisis medicine. Principle is consequentialist, and it is correct. And it is also the kind of thing that sits in your chest differently than it reads in a textbook. Prioritized stage 3 cases first, because the window for them was closing fastest. We prioritized stage 2 cases next, down from the most advanced. Stage 1 cases, the majority of the population, were in a holding pattern that we assessed as stable enough to wait, and the waiting was the part that required the most from everyone. Stage 1 was not comfortable. I want to be clear about that. The conclave's classification framing, calling it Stage 1, which sounds manageable, understated its quality. Stage 1 individuals described, through their translators, what amounted to a constant low-level disorientation, a fuzziness in the visual communication field that their vel nodes produced, a species that communicates primarily through light, meant that every interaction was like trying to hold a conversation through frosted glass. They were present, they were functional, mostly, but they were muffled, and they knew it. And they were watching their Stage 2 and Stage 3 family members from behind that frosted glass. And they could do nothing but wait. The station's counseling staff, 2 individuals, both themselves in Stage 1, had organized a support framework that I can only describe as remarkable under the circumstances. Regular communication sessions for Stage 1 individuals, structured activity to sustain cognitive engagement, a buddy system to ensure no one was isolated. They had done this spontaneously, without direction, in the 10 days before we arrived. Dr. Asim showed me their program documentation on day 2, and I spent a moment reading it and thinking about the quality of people who, when faced with their own slow dimming, turn first toward each other. Dr. Asim noticed me reading and said, "We do not have a tradition of waiting alone." "I can see that," I said. "It is not a cultural virtue," he said. And here his translator paused for a fraction of a second, which was the tell for a vel-sorath framing something carefully. It is a biological one. The vel nodes respond to proximity. The presence of other lit individuals sustains activation. When we are ill and the light in us is low, we gather, because gathering is measurably better than isolation for vel node function. It is not sentiment, it is physiology. Medicine often turns out to be that way, I said. His chest light moved slowly. Yes, he said. I have noticed. Dr. Asim understood the math before I explained it to him. When I brought him the triage protocol, he read it without expression. "NEL," then he said, "there is a residential sector on Ring 4 that has a higher concentration of Stage 2 cases than the rest of the station, the extraction workers. They were closest to the release point. We'll start there after the current cases," I said. "Some of them are children," he said. "Children go to the top of the Stage 2 queue," I said. Across the board, his light moved in the pattern I'd come to recognize as the acknowledgement he made when he was holding something he couldn't fully carry. He nodded. They had learned the human gesture in the years of contact, and it meant the same thing in their usage as it did in ours. We sent 4 of our medical staff into Ring 4. I stayed in the central facility and ran a 3rd iteration of the dosage protocol. We were learning from every administration, refining the timing and the concentration, and by the 20th patient, the protocol was significantly more precise than it had been at the first. Helonen, who had barely slept since we entered the cordon, was running synthesis continuously. Raffi had the delivery system optimized to the point where he could adapt it to individual patient parameters in minutes. The 4 extraction corridor was a long, curved space that followed the outer arc of the residential ring, and it was lined on both sides with the alcove structures I'd come to understand as a vel-sorath architectural idiom. Recessed spaces sized for 1 or 2 individuals, set into the wall at approximately 2/3 of human height, designed for the communal rest that their physiology required. Every alcove had someone in it. The ones who were not too ill to move had arranged themselves to face the corridor, watching the medical team pass, their light patterns communicating things I could not decode, but that had the texture of attention, and, in some of them, hope. My colleague Dr. Priya Nair, who had come aboard the Resolute Mercy, specifically for her expertise in pediatric xenomedicine, took the children's ward in Ring 4. I will give her the credit she is due. She worked for 18 straight hours that first day in the ring, administering to 19 children ranging from infancy to early adolescence, adapting the dosage protocol on the fly for bodies whose metabolic parameters differed from adult norms in ways our original calibration had not fully accounted for. She is not a large person, and she moves very quietly, and she has the quality of stillness that children respond to, quality that crosses species lines with less friction than most things. And I know from Dr. Asim's records that the children's recovery rate in Ring 4 was among the best on the station. On the second day, we began seeing recovery arcs. Not in the stage 3 cases mostly, the most advanced cases. The ones who had been dark for longest showed improvement, but slowly. 2 of the 5 original cases did not improve. I need to say that plainly. 2 of those 5 patients did not respond adequately to the compound, and the vel node degradation had progressed to the point where even a functioning inhibitor could not reverse what had already been lost. They were stable. Their progression had halted. But the function that had been lost before we arrived did not return. I do not know what the long-term prognosis for them is. I hope it is livable. But the stage 2 or 2 recoveries, those were something. Stage 2, caught early enough, with the compound administered at adequate concentration, showed remarkable response. The vel node index would climb steadily over 12 to 18 hours. Not in the dramatic surge of fictional medicine, but in the real grinding, measurable increment of biology reversing an insult, cell by cell, organelle by organelle. And as it climbed, the individual would surface, would come back from wherever the degradation had taken them, and the light would return. I saw it happen for the first time in a child. A girl 7 years old by the vel-sorath age reckoning corresponds to perhaps 9 or 10 in human developmental terms. She had been in stage 2 for 6 days and was near the boundary of stage 3, and her light had been reduced to a faint, irregular gutter across her face and hands. Parents were both stage 1, exposed but earlier, and they had been sitting with her for 3 days in the wing we'd set up in ring 4. I administered the compound myself. Not because I needed to, any of my team could have done it, but because I wanted to be there. 10 hours later, her face lit. Not all at once, not in a single moment. Over the course of perhaps 20 minutes, the vel nodes across her face began to wake up, one cluster at a time, finding their pattern again, and the light that came back was not the subdued light of an ill child. It was the full, complex, living brightness of a vel-sorath child who is present, who is aware, who is looking around at the room and at her parents and at the strange, dark-skinned woman in the medical coat who is sitting on a crate in the corner, trying not to visibly fall apart. Parents lit up simultaneously, a cascade response I had not anticipated and that Dr. Asim later explained to me is a known phenomenon in vel-sorath families, a resonance between intimately bonded vel node clusters that can trigger sympathetic activation. Both parents, whose own vel nodes had been dimmed by their stage 1 exposure, suddenly blazed with a brightness that exceeded their baseline because they were running a full emotional activation cascade on top of recovery, and the light they produced in that moment was extraordinary. Genuinely extraordinary. The kind of thing I am not going to find adequate words for, so I will say only that I have worked in medicine for 22 years, and that was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen in a hospital. I did not cry. I had too much work to do. I waited until I was in the supply corridor, alone for about 90 seconds. Then I went back to work. The conclave reached us on the 3rd day. It was not a friendly contact. The message came from a regional quarantine authority vessel that had positioned itself at the cordon boundary, 42 million kilometers away, carefully not crossing the line they'd drawn. And the communication was a formal notice of sanctioned proceedings against the Resolute Mercy. Captain Aaron Vasak, an Earth Humanitarian Medical Service, citing violation of a Class 1 quarantine order, breach of conclave regulatory authority in subsector 12, and unauthorized administration of untested medical compounds to a protected species. Population. Captain Vasak received it on the bridge and forwarded it to me with a note that said, FI continuing. I sent a reply to the conclave vessel. It was not a long reply. It contained our current patient census, our outcome data for the first 60 hours of treatment, the dosage protocol documentation, and a request for any conclave medical expertise that wished to join the effort inside the cordon. I indicated that we would be delighted to be reviewed, audited, sanctioned, or subjected to whatever proceeding the conclave found appropriate, at such time as our current caseload was no longer acute. I suggested that this would be in approximately 3 to 4 days, and I asked them to let us know if they had any questions in the meantime. The reply I received, 12 hours later, was from a different officer. It was shorter. It said that the Conclave Regional Medical Office had reviewed the transmitted data and that 3 of their member world specialists being dispatched to the cordon boundary to review the methodology. It did not say the sanctions were withdrawn. It also did not tell us to stop. We did not stop. The math changed on day 4. We had entered the cordon with 400 doses. We had administered approximately 340 of them. We had 60 doses remaining, and an estimated population of about 800 patients still untreated in stage 2. The gap between what we had and what we needed was not small. I had been aware of this gap since day 2. I had been running the numbers in the back of my mind the way you run a background process. Not urgently, not yet, but constantly, because the supply problem was the terminal problem, the one that all the clinical success in the world could not resolve if the compound ran out before the population was treated. I had raised it once with the Conclave regional vessel at the cordon boundary, asking Zoesre supplies for might be possible without their medical personnel needing to enter the zone. Their response had been bureaucratically cautious. They were reviewing the matter, and I had returned to the lab and not raised it again, because I had work to do, and because the Conclave, whatever its institutional virtues, was not moving at the speed the situation required. What I had not known, because I had not thought to ask, was that Halonen had also been running the numbers, and that Halonen, being Halonen, had not stopped at the number. He had gone past it to the solution. I told Halonen, he said, without looking up from his synthesis unit, I've been thinking about this. Tell me, I said. The compound's binding site is a relatively simple inhibitor chain, he said. It's not the synthesis that's resource intensive. It's the stabilizing medium we're suspending it in, because we designed the medium for our storage systems, not for high-volume production. If I modify the suspension chemistry to use components we have in larger supply, he tapped a list onto his screen, I can run a smaller molecule, suspension that has a shorter shelf life, but is producible in much higher volume, maybe 2 to 3 times the output per day, running continuous. Efficacy impact. Shelf life drops from 21 days to 48 hours. We'd be running hot, synthesize, administer, synthesize. Compound itself is unchanged. The therapeutic effect should be equivalent. I looked at the list of components. We had them. We had enough of them. Do it, I said. I started 6 hours ago, he said. I wanted to confirm the chemistry before I told you. Halonen had, telling me, already solved the problem he was in the process of informing me about. I made a note to put something appropriately large in his personnel file and went to tell Dr. Asim that our supply problem had a solution. He received the news with the slow, complex light pattern I had come to associate with carefully contained relief, a long exhalation in light rather than sound. Then he said, "There is something I should tell you." "Tell me," I said. "I sent a message to the Conclave Regional Health Office on the first day," he said. "Before you arrived, when the quarantine was issued, I asked them to authorize emergency humanitarian access. I described the population status, the progression rate, the absence of adequate treatment resources. I sent the same message to 3 Conclave member medical organizations with the resources to help. I know," I said. "I read your distress log when we came in. None of them responded," he said. The Conclave acknowledged receipt of my message and informed me that the quarantine was in effect and that treatment resources were being assessed. That was the last communication I received from them before you docked. He said this without anger. That was the part that stayed with me. He said it with the measured, exhausted clarity of a physician who had been watching his people go dark and had sent the calls and had not been answered, and who was now, somehow, finding his way back towards something that was not anger and was not gratitude and was not quite relief, but was in the territory of all 3. "I want to understand something," he said. "You were already en route when the quarantine order came." "Yes." "Earth dispatched you before the Conclave issued the seal." "Yes." "Your distress signal reached our regional coordination office 9 days ago. We were already the nearest medical asset. The deployment order came through 48 hours after that, and we were underway within 6 hours. Conclave had been notified of the outbreak before they issued the quarantine," he said. "They issued the quarantines instead of authorizing aid." "I can't speak to their reasoning," I said. "No," he said. "But Earth did not wait for their authorization." "Earth isn't a Conclave member," said. We don't operate under their authorization framework. We operate under our own medical ethics charter, which says that when there's a population in acute medical distress and we have the capacity to help, we go. The politics sort themselves out afterward. His light moved in a long, slow pattern across his chest. Then he said something in his own language, a phrase of perhaps 6 syllables, before the translator engaged. That phrase doesn't translate well, his translator said. Approximate meaning, the quality of an action that has no calculation behind it. I didn't have a word for it either, but I recognized what he was describing. On day 5, the first vel-sorath who had completed treatment and recovered to baseline came to find me. She was a dock worker. Her name was Velshan Moret, and she was perhaps 40 years old with a full, complex light pattern across her surface that moved constantly as she walked, the way a healthy vel-sorath moves. Not like a static display, but like living water, responsive to every thought and shift and intention. She was moving very fast, and when she found me in the corridor outside the synthesis room, she stopped and stood in front of me and said something. Her translator rendered as, "I want to help. Tell me what to carry." I looked at her for a moment. "Can you operate a delivery system if I show you the protocol?" "Yes," she said. "Come with me." Over the next 2 days, as more patients recovered, we had volunteers. First a few, then dozens, then more than we could usefully integrate. Recovered vel-sorath who came to the medical facility and said, in whatever words their translator produced, some version of, "Tell me what to carry, show me what to do, let me be useful." We trained the ones we could. We sent the rest to support functions, carrying supplies, helping move patients, sitting with the people who were still sick and needed someone present. The sitting with was not a small thing. I had observed from the first day that the vel-sorath did not do well in isolation. Dr. Asim had explained the physiology of it, the way vel nodes respond to proximity, the way the light of nearby healthy individuals functions as a genuine neurological support for those in recovery. We had been short-staffed for that function since we arrived. The presence of recovered volunteers, moving through the wards with their full, complex light patterns, sitting with the dimmed, and the diminished and simply being there, was not a comfort measure. It was a clinical intervention. We documented it as such. I watched Velshan Moret work. She was methodical, attentive, possessed of a quality of cheerful competence that reminded me, in a way I found unexpectedly affecting, of Rafi Shamir. She learned the delivery protocol in 40 minutes. She adapted to each patient's parameters without prompting. She did not treat the work as charity. She treated it as obvious. When I told her at the end of her first day that she was doing good work, she looked at me with what her light pattern rendered, and Dr. Asim later confirmed, as something close to mild impatience. Of course she was doing good work. The people in those beds were her people. What else would she do, Dr. Asim organized them with the quiet efficiency he seemed to bring to everything. He had gone from stage 1 to recovering over the course of day 3 and 4. He had not allowed us to prioritize him, had insisted on waiting until the critical cases were handled, and when I finally administered the compound to him personally on day 4, he accepted it without comment and went back to work 4 hours later, when his index showed clear early improvement, and I did not try to stop him because I understood the particular stubbornness of the physician who will not leave their patients. The station's rings began to brighten. I noticed it first at night, our ship time night, when the activity on the medical floor slowed and I would walk the corridors to check on the overnight cases. The residential rings, visible through the station's internal viewports, were getting brighter. Not uniformly. There were still dark patches, still areas where the light was thin and irregular. But the overall luminance was rising. The direction of it was rising. On day 6, I walked through Ring 4 for the first time since the first day. The extraction workers' residential corridor, where the heaviest concentration of stage 2 cases had been. I had only seen it at full triage tempo. Bright lights, medical equipment everywhere, focused urgency of acute care. I saw it now at rest. The corridor was calm. Most of the patients had been moved or discharged. The few who remained were in the stable phase of their recovery, lights steady and growing. The families of the recovered had come back. They were there in the corridor, the reconnection of people who had been separated by illness and distance. and the light they made together was layered and complex and alive. I stood there for a while. I was not in the way of anything. I just stood there and watched the light. On day 7, the 3 conclave medical specialists arrived at the cordon boundary and requested permission to enter. Captain Vasak transmitted their request to the station, and Dr. Asim, who as station chief medical officer held the actual quarantine authority for internal access, authorized them. They came in on a conclave transport, a small efficient vessel, and docked without ceremony. They were from 3 different species. I will not describe them in detail because it is not relevant to this account. I will say that they were all wearing the Conclave Medical Services gray and gold livery, and that when they came through our docking collar and I met them in the anteroom, the first thing the senior specialist did was look at the patient census board I'd set up on the wall. The running count of cases, outcomes, recovery rates, current status, and she stood there for a long moment in silence before she turned to me. The silence lasted perhaps 10 seconds. It was not a hostile silence. It was the silence of someone whose expectations have been revised in real time and who is taking the revision seriously. I have been in that silence myself. The moment of recalibration when the data on the wall does not match data you had prepared to find, and I held my own position and waited. How many administered doses? She said. 712, I said. We extended supply on day 4 with modified suspension chemistry. I have the full synthesis record. Stage 3 recovery outcomes? 2 of 5 original cases non-responsive to full recovery. Stable, no further progression, but incomplete vel node regeneration. The other 3 have recovered to approximately 80 to 90% of assessed baseline. For all stage 3 cases admitted subsequently, outcomes have been better. I believe the day 4 protocol improvements are a factor. Stage 2 outcomes? Recovery rates above 92% for cases treated within the first 48 hours of stage 2 onset. Lower for advanced stage 2 at the time of administration. We're at 78% for that cohort. All cases showing full arrest of progression even where recovery is incomplete. She was quiet for a moment. One of the other specialists, a younger individual, who had the quality of someone still learning the professional register of formal review, and managing it with visible effort, had taken out a recording instrument and was capturing the census board. The third specialist was reading the synthesis record summary I'd filed at the top of our data stack. Expression, neutral in the way of someone who has trained themselves to evaluate before reacting. Earth developed this compound independently, she said. Yes. We had no access to the conclave's pathology resources. We worked from the published literature and our own modeling. In how long? The compound's basis was 6 weeks in development before we entered the zone. We adapted the protocol during the approach and during the first 48 hours in station. She exchanged a look with the other 2 specialists. Something passed between them that I couldn't read. Then she said, "We will need to review the full synthesis records and the clinical documentation." "Of course," I said. "Everything is available. I would be glad of the review." She looked at the census board again. She looked at it for what I estimated was a full 10 seconds longer than she needed to take in the numbers, and I can only surmise that she was doing what I have done when I encounter an outcome I did not expect, sitting with the distance between what she had anticipated finding here and what she was actually looking at. A quarantine zone, population crisis, a hospital ship from a non-member world, and a census board that said, in the plain language of numbers, that the non-member world had come in without authorization and had done the work. Then she said, and I am rendering this as accurately as I can, because the way she said it mattered, we will need to amend the quarantine order. It was not an apology. I did not expect an apology, and I want to be clear that the absence of one did not diminish what happened here. I am a doctor. I deal in outcomes. The outcome was that the quarantine order was amended to permit conclave medical support to enter, that the conclave's 3 specialists worked alongside my team for the next 48 hours, in a collaboration that was, by the end, genuinely productive, and that the formal sanction proceedings against the Resolute Mercy suspended pending review of the humanitarian circumstances. Whether they are eventually dropped or result in something more, I do not know. That is for lawyers to manage, and I am not a lawyer. On day 9, we began preparing to leave. The station's population of 9,000 had been treated in full over the course of 8 days. Our final tally, 741 doses administered prior to the conclave team's arrival. Approximately 308 doses administered in collaboration with the conclave team using their own supply was significantly larger than ours after they validated our protocol and began operating under it. Recovery rates overall were above 88%. Complete vel node restoration, full return to assessed baseline, was achieved in 60% of cases. In the remaining cases, partial recovery, with functional improvement and progression arrest in all but 6 individuals whose advanced stage 3 degradation had been too severe. 6 people I could not bring back from where the darkness had taken them. I have all of their names in my records. Dr. Asim walked with me to the docking collar on the morning of day 9. The Resolute Mercy was loaded and ready. My team was aboard. Hallinan had spent the previous evening writing up the synthesis protocol in a format the conclave specialists could use for further production. Not because he was asked to, but because it was the obvious thing to do, and Hallinan was a man who did the obvious thing efficiently and without needing to be asked. The docking corridor was lit. The station's rings were bright in the way they had presumably been before the release. Complex layered light of 9,000 vel-sorath going about their lives in the quiet morning of a working station. As we walked, the people we passed would stop and look at us. Not staring, not the frozen attention of alarm, but a directed, attentive regard. And the light in their surface patterns would shift in ways that I could not read, but that I recognized as deliberate. They were saying something. I didn't know what. Dr. Asim, who had been quiet for most of the walk, said, "They are expressing a formal regard. In our culture, there is a light pattern for the acknowledgement of a debt. Not as a transaction, not as an obligation, as a recognition of the weight of what was done." "I don't know how to answer it," I said. "You don't need to," he said. "The regard is complete in itself. It doesn't require a response." We stopped at the collar. Through the docking port window, I could see the churn Resolute Mercy access corridor, the familiar white walls, and the medical blue stripe at the floor, the ordinary fluorescent light of a human-designed interior. "I want to say something," Dr. Asim said. "You don't have to," I said. "I know," he said. "I want to." He was quiet for a moment. His light, the full, recovered, complex animation of a healthy vel-sorath, moved in a long, slow pattern that started at his hands and moved upward across his chest and face, and then held for several seconds in a configuration I had never seen and would not see again, because I have come to understand that configuration is reserved for particular moments. And I was present for this one, and I will say only that it was not a small thing. Then he spoke. He spoke in his own language, the pulse and glow language that the translator handles imperfectly, the language that exists between the words, and he spoke for perhaps 30 seconds, and his translator was silent. 30 seconds of light. I waited. When he stopped, the translator said, "That language does not go through the translation system." "I know," I said. "It was not intended to." "I know," I said again. I put my hand out. He looked at it for a moment, the human gesture, the one they'd adopted from us over 2 centuries of contact, the one that meant approximately what his light pattern meant, in a different medium, and he took it and held it for a moment with the particular gravity of someone who understands that the gesture belongs to a different language than his own and is using it correctly anyway. Then I went aboard. The collar sealed. Resolute Mercy undocked, and Petrov took us out smooth on the reverse thrusters. And I went to the observation port at the end of crew deck 2, where there is a window that looks back along our approach vector, and I watched the station as we pulled away. It occurred to me, standing there, that I had entered this station in the dark. Not the dark of space, which is simply the absence of stars nearby, but the specific functional dark of a place that should have been lit and was not. I had spent 9 days in the irregular, patchy, dimming light of 9,000 people whose nervous systems were failing, and I had become so accustomed to reading that light, to watching it as a vital sign readout, that I had stopped noticing consciously how different it was from what it should be. I noticed now, because the rings were bright, all of them. The full, complex, living brightness of a population that was still there, still lit, still in the world. The light through those transparent panels was not the static glow of infrastructure. It moved, it shifted. It had the constant low-level animation of thousands of individuals going about their lives. Their vel nodes running all the ordinary transactions of vel-sorath existence, thought and communication and feeling, and all the 10,000 unremarkable things that a nervous system does in the course of a day that you do not notice until it stops doing them. As we gained distance, the station resolved from a structure into a point of light, a single soft glow in the long dark of a system 40 astronomical units from its star, a light that should not have been there and was. I stayed at the window until I couldn't see it anymore. Captain Vasek filed his final log entry on the run home. He showed it to me. He does that occasionally when he thinks I should see the record he's made. The entry was, like the man, brief and deliberate. Tree, he had written. M's Resolute Mercy, outbound from vel-sorath Station Kemalith, Day 9. Population status, stable, recovering, sanction proceedings, pending review, crew status, exhausted, intact, medical outcome, acceptable. Noting for the record that Earth Humanitarian Dispatch received 1 distress call and sent 1 hospital ship, and that the ship did its job. No further notation required. No further notation required. That was Vasak. That was the whole of it. For him, the job was done, the log was correct, and the rest was someone else's concern. I wrote my own notes separately, in the clinical record where they belong. I documented the synthesis methodology, the dosage protocol, the outcome data, adaptation curve, the conclave collaboration, final patient census. I documented all of it with the rigor Dr. Asim's own records had modeled for me. Because a thing worth doing is worth doing in a way that someone else can learn from and build on. I also wrote, in a separate document, that is not technically part of the clinical record, but that I have filed with my personal logs, the following. On Day 9, Dr. Velhar Asim said something at the docking collar that his translator did not render. 3 seconds in the pulse and glow language. I have been told this language does not go through the translation system. I believe that to be true. I also believe that I understood it regardless. The way you understand some things not because you have learned the words but because you have been in the room long enough to know what is being said. He was thanking us. He was thanking us for coming when no one else did, for staying when we were told to turn around, for working through 9 days in a station that was going dark. While his people went quiet, and the galaxy held its distance, and the quarantine order sat on the frequencies like a door closed against the cold. Don't know what it said. I know what it meant. Treat, that is enough. The sanctions were eventually dropped. It took 14 months and a formal review by the Conclave's Medical Ethics Commission, which concluded that the humanitarian circumstances of the entry constituted an arguable exception to the cordon protocol, and that the documented outcomes substantially mitigated the technical violation. The Resolute Mercy, a letter of acknowledgement from the Conclave Regional Health Authority, not an apology, which I had not expected, but an acknowledgement, which I had. vel-sorath Station Kemalith sent a formal communique to Earth Humanitarian Medical Service headquarters in Nairobi 3 months after return. It was brief as formal communiques tend to be. It expressed the station community's recognition of the service rendered and its intention to establish a cultural exchange program with Earth's medical institutions, particular focus on xenobiological training in vel-node medicine. There was a postscript to the communique. It was not in formal language. It was not in the language of official exchange. It was a short paragraph in the translated common tongue, and it was signed with Dr. Asim's name, and it said, the phrase I tried to give you at the docking collar, the one that does not go through the translator. I have asked 3 linguists to attempt a rendering. They have given me 3 different answers, none of them fully satisfying. The nearest approximation any of them has offered is the character of a door left open that did not need to be. I think you will understand this. I think you understood it then. I did. The door was open. We went through it. That is what we do.